Chapter 1. My Angle of Approach. I grew up in a home where my father, a theology professor, read to my two brothers and me the delightfully neo-medieval stories of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, George MacDonald, and others. These were influences in shaping not only my imagination, but also the faith I would find as a young adult. From the moment Christianity became my heart language, I searched its vocabulary and traditions for the angles of vision first opened to me in those early literary stirrings. Where I found these angles, they tended to help me move forward in my faith. Where I did not find them, I wondered why not. Since then, I've never lost my fascination with either those modern authors or the medieval world they loved. Of course, they sometimes romanticized that world, but they also, as we'll see, took it quite seriously as a source of wisdom for living. During my doctoral program in American church history at Duke University, a band of friends formed an Inklings group. Together we read and discussed those same medieval-influenced authors, reaching for the older Christian wisdom from which they drew. After Duke, I took a job editing Christian History magazine at Christianity Today. While there, I edited issues and wrote articles on Lewis and Tolkien, as well as G.K. Chesterton, author of two splendid biographies of important medieval Christians, Dorothy L. Sayers, translator of Dante and medieval French literature, and others. At the same time, I was able to continue my exploration, begun in graduate school, of such medieval thinkers as Bernard of Nursia, about 480 to 543, Bernard of Clairvaux, 1090 to 1153, and the scholastic precursors of the scientific revolution. In those years, I began work on my first book, Patron Saints for Postmoderns, in which I explore the medieval worlds and worldviews of Gregory the Great, 540 to 604, Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321, and Marjorie Kemp, about 1373 to sometime after 1438, among others. All of this began to prepare me to see beyond modern caricatures of the medieval church to the animating Christian spirit of that age. But at the same time, I was becoming more and more acutely aware of certain realities of the church today, especially its evangelical Protestant forms, that make it hard for modern Christians truly to receive medieval wisdom. When in 2004, I flew from Chicagoland to Minnesota to interview for a church history position at Bethel Seminary, the interviewers asked what period I thought my evangelical students would most need to hear about. I did not yet entirely know why, but I blurted out, "The Middle Ages." A one-sided story. I soon found ample evidence, both negative and positive, to back up that impulsive answer. In my first year at Bethel, the evangelical authored textbook I chose to use with my classes proved embarrassingly incomplete and biased in its treatment of medieval faith. Even after I found better sources and began sharing the good as well as the bad and the ugly in my lectures on the period, some of my students seemed unable to surmount their preconceptions. Many ignored the warning attached to my standard essay question on the lessons we can learn from the medieval church. Do not limit yourself to negative examples. They listed only parodies and partial truths. The state ruled the church, money corrupted the church and prevented it from helping the people. The Bible was taken away from the people. The monastics failed to evangelize or engage the culture, etc. Slowly, as I learned how to better teach the period, some of my students began to find rich resources in the disciplines of the monastics, the devotion of the mystics, the intellectual passion of the scholastics, and much more. Formerly suspicious of all things medieval, these students began to discover and value some of the wisdom this book points to. Increasingly, though, I wondered about the hole in modern popular accounts of church history, particularly the glaring omission of the story of medieval faith except as a cautionary tale. Why did my students and friends so often seem to assume that the church apostatized after it gained cultural influence in the time of Constantine, 4th century, and returned to God only after the 16th century Reformation, or perhaps even only after the evangelical revivals of the 18th century? Why this dismissal of more than a millennium of church history, more than half of the time between Christ and today. I don't deny that the terrain of the medieval church seems alien to most of us. Before us, relics peer out from within gilded boxes, and the devout approach them as conduits to divine power. Above us, saints hover supernaturally, and the earthbound plead for their intercession. At the high altar, the priest, with his back to the congregation, performs an elaborate sacred drama, elevating the bread and wine and speaking the words of institution, while the devout await the ringing of the bell, gazing at those elements and seeing the literal body and blood of Christ. Within the confessional, the penitent kneels, receives absolution, and hears the works of satisfaction she must perform for her soul's sake. And in cathedrals, cloisters, and cow pastures, mitred bishops pronounce on doctrine, tonsured monks sing psalms, and ragged peasants supplicate Mary with weeping. Lenses of relevance. It seems to me, however, that the chasm between us and our medieval forebears in the faith has to do less with any intrinsic oddness of the Christians of that time, and more with certain philosophical and cultural presuppositions of our own. Though it may seem strange for a book about medieval wisdom to start with an assessment of the church today, this one will, for two reasons. First, this is my scholarly center of gravity. I come to the wisdom of medieval faith not through long technical study of the church in the Middle Ages, though I have read many of the key primary works in translation along with many helpful secondary sources, but through scholarship on American Christianity that, alongside a decade of teaching in an evangelical seminary and daily experience in many Western evangelical ecclesial settings, has given me an acute sense of some deep needs of these churches today. Second, although the Historical Guild warns us against pressing historical periods to answer modern questions alien to their own realities, an approach to history that does not account for its modern relevance may quite literally be worse than useless. Finding moral, intellectual, and spiritual value for our own lives is the whole point of doing history. There is no way to understand the value of the past for our present experience without understanding our own time well. Of course, I see the Middle Ages through modern lenses, but so do even the most careful of scholar specialists. Indeed, the best of them do this not only unconsciously, but also quite intentionally. They know that when we study a past period, without connecting it to our own, we fall into mere antiquarianism, like the numismatist, collecting rare coins for no purpose higher than the sheer pleasure of having them. G.K. Chesterton thought you could not be a proper medievalist until you cared deeply enough about today to apply medieval insights to your own life and thinking. I think he's exactly right. To be an antiquarian, beguiling yourself with stories and collecting facts like butterflies, but never asking what it all might mean for us today, is to fail to be a useful historian, no matter what era turns your crank. So the only sensible reason to care about the past is that, through knowing it, you believe you can make a better present. The chief purpose of history is moral improvement. This means we must derive lessons for today from our study of history. But to do so, we must discern our own time, too. A church in need of new life. The American church today is in turmoil. We have tried, by turns, rational apologetics, pop culture-inflected consumerist church programs, ecstatic charismatic experience, and postmodern experimentation, but none of these has proved lasting. The rationalism of modern apologetics has collapsed as the questions of the unchurched have turned away from doctrine, and the agonies of the unchurched have centered on spirituality and practice rather than belief. The beguiling concerts and spectacles of the church growth technicians have fallen short of their promise, revealing the dismally shallow spirituality behind the curtain. The experientialism of the charismatic movement has faltered in the quest to build lasting, faithful, disciple churches as worshipers have bounced from one high to the next. The postmodernism of the now faded emerging movement never found a positive program for reform to accompany its often strident critique of current church culture. Could it be that God is driving us out of these failed experiments and into the wilderness, traveling as pilgrims toward a more solid faith and a more faithful church? Turning to a more dire metaphor, could it be that the contemporary church lingers in a twilight between vitality and morbidity, sustained by a kind of spiritual life support? And if so, what is our prognosis? I believe there is hope, for we are on the list for a life-giving transplant. It had better come soon, to be sure, but when it does, it promises to revive and strengthen us in ways unimaginable. This transplant, like most others, will involve the surgical implantation into the patient of living organs taken from a dead donor. What living organs? The life-giving beliefs and practices of our own spiritual heritage. Which donor? Our mother, the Church, in her first 2,000 years. This is not traditionalism, which, as Yaroslav Pelikan famously quipped, is the dead faith of the living. To transplant a dead organ will only kill the patient. Rather, it is tradition, the living faith of the dead. Weak and on our sick beds, we await a transfusion of that life. So far, surgeons such as D.H. Williams, Robert Louis Wilkin, and Thomas Oden have found vital organs in the doctrinal formulations of the Church's first 6 centuries, and they have rushed them to modern Christian hospitals. And individually, though not yet as ecclesia, a few here and there are beginning to receive these transplants, and new life is flooding into them. Other medics, such as Richard Foster, Eugene Peterson, and the late Dallas Willard, have turned to organs of spiritual practice. They provide from any and every Christian tradition a piecemeal infusion of intentional spirituality that, while still largely unformed and understudied, now sustains some. From the rich medieval tradition of spirituality in particular, these good doctors are leading modern Christians to rediscover ascetic practices, grow under spiritual directors, go on retreats at monasteries, and meditate after the manner of the Lectio Divina. Yet many modern Protestants still believe that they can be faithful to their Reformation heritage only by rejecting the medieval heritage. They perceive medieval faith as not just Catholic, but Roman Catholic, or in its Eastern forms, Eastern Orthodox, and thus hyper-sacramental, semi-Pelagian, institutional, nominal. For these folks, as for the Hollywood of pulp fiction, to get medieval is to do violence. It is to do violence both to the Reformation doctrinal heritage of salvation by faith and to the revivalist spiritual heritage of direct, unmediated access to God in Christ. Those who succumb to these stereotypes do not know how badly they misconstrue the Continental Reformation, and to a lesser degree American revivalism, and especially the medieval traditions from which they insist on cutting themselves off. God did not, after all, leave his church in the Emperor Constantine's day only to reappear with Martin Luther, John Wesley, and Billy Graham. The shorter way. To begin to understand the barrier that stands between us and medieval wisdom, consider this vignette from the period that defined American evangelicalism more than any other, the Victorian era. In 1850, Methodist laywoman Phoebe Worrell Palmer, 1807-74, published a book called The Way of Holiness. In it, she said about the traditional Methodist teaching of sanctification, "Yes, brother, there is a shorter way. Oh, I am sure this long waiting and struggling with the powers of darkness is not necessary. There is a shorter way." These words would turn out to be momentous for 19th-century American evangelicals. Already by that year, a flood of church leaders, including several Methodist bishops, had for more than a decade been visiting Palmer's New York City parlor to attend her Tuesday meetings for the promotion of holiness. And within a decade, her holiness movement jumped denominational lines, initiating Presbyterians, Quakers, Baptists, and Episcopalians into this optimistic creed. The essence of Palmer's message is this: no more would Christians have to pursue a fraught and painstaking path to holiness, reminiscent of the slow, agonizing road to conversion once trod by English and American Puritans. By simply gathering their resolve, making a single act of consecration, and standing on the promises, certain scripture texts that seem to hold out entire sanctification as an attainable reality, they can enjoy total freedom from sin.